Nothing else to say, really. My view about stand-up comedians is that they're all geniuses because you have to be so quick on your feet, and I couldn't do it. I think you have to be just superbly fast. And
Well, I think I'd also call Simon a bit of a cultural polymath, really. He
I
writes,
thought I was doing it, James.
well,
He intrudes now. This is what happens, Simon. He asks me to do something, then he butts in.
oh, I wish he'd kept you on mute, to be honest. Anyway, Simon, it's lovely to have you here with us. And
I haven't finished yet.
oh, for goodness sake, it's impossible. It's impossible. Do you know, Simon, I've tried my best. Every week I send him Dignitas flyers and he never takes them. Right.
Well, you know what the postal service is like, James. Probably.
Okay. Well, I'd like to just go straight into.
Can I finish my point, please?
Go ahead. Go ahead.
It's lovely for Simon to be here because I think he's one of the great stand-ups, and also with a seriously wide range of cultural reference. And I think he's just a genius. And we're privileged to have you, Simon. So thank you.
Very kind of you, Sean. Before not that you've exactly phrased it as a question, but I certainly don't think your criteria for genius stands in stand-up comedy circles. You don't actually have to be that quick at all on your feet if that's your criterion. It's an illusion which we work hard to create and sustain, but it's not actually necessary to react very quickly to what's happening in front of you as a stand-up comedian. The vast majority of stand-ups, including some that are very successful, very rarely react to anything that's happening around them. They know exactly where they're going. It's all been mapped out beforehand. And the illusion of spontaneity is it's one of the more devious tricks of the trade, I'm afraid.
Well, so when you apply to sorry.
We've heard enough from you, Sean. So when you are doing a stand-up show, let's say it's about an hour, that's all rehearsed and you've remembered all the lines that you've written for it, have you?
Well, for my personal shows, I mean, I do about 2 hours now when I'm on tour. And yes, the vast majority of it is either stuff that I know I'm going to say, or I give myself some space to explore something in real time. And if something occurs to me to add in, I'll drop it in. And if it gets a laugh, it tends to stay there. That, for some reason, tends to lodge in the memory in a way that if you're sitting in the dressing room or in the car or at your desk the day before and you think of a new line that could be inserted, it's extraordinary how rarely you remember that when it comes to that moment on stage. But if it's got a laugh previously because it was introduced spontaneously, but that's not necessary. That's not quite the same as reaction time, if you understand what I mean. It's just something that might occur or might not. You have to make yourself available to that moment of inspiration. But if you're lucky, if you get half a dozen new lines in the course of a 2-hour show, gradually over the course of a tour, the show expands and becomes much more finely threaded, like a tapestry that starts off with broad brushstrokes and ends up being quite detailed. But it's not brushstrokes, obviously on a tapestry, that would be inappropriate. But
that'd be just royal, wouldn't it?
Yes. But yeah, that's how I think of it, as growing and entangling itself and becoming more like a monkey's fist as the show goes on. But the reaction to the crowd thing, I think for some reason it's a notion of stand-up that's quite dearly cherished by audiences. That a big part of the skill is coping with hecklers, for instance. I can go 2 or 3 dozen shows between heckles. It's extraordinary how rarely they occur, and when they do, they're very, very rarely complicated or real tripwires. They're usually either inarticulate grunts or something you can just mock as having been sort of obviously subhuman intervention.
I wanted to ask you
yes,
two questions, Simon. The first is because you studied law, didn't you, at Southampton?
Yeah.
So what was the trajectory that took you from that into stand-up into what you're doing now?
Well, it was quite
long.
long.
My second question will be something different. because obviously it's going to be different from the first question. Anyway, go on.
Oh, no. Okay, well, I'll answer that first question on its own and then see if it covers your second one accidentally. It was a very long trajectory. I graduated in 1986 and I did my first stand-up gig in 1996, so a full decade passed. But I suppose a few of the skills that I'd learned, or at least a few of the talents that I felt I had and wanted to harness and put to the use of a career at the bar, turned out to be equally useful in stand-up, articulation and so on. But other skills I was sorely lacking. I realized quite early on in my time at Southampton University that I just didn't have the capacity for the reading. If you want to make a career of it at the bar, there is much more reading than John Mortimer had led me to suppose. I had been fooled. I mean, I'll tell you my rough trajectory. Basically, I left university, worked, did a bit of temping to get make ends meet in central London, got a job selling advertising space. My intention was at that point, I wanted to launch a magazine which would be somewhere between Private Eye and the Olympia Press of Paris in the sort of, I think it was in the 60s, wasn't it, when it used to publish things like Lady Chatterley's Lover and Aeneas Nin and so on, and slightly disreputable works that later were perceived to be genius, but were just originally perceived to be smut. So I wanted a sort of combination of erotica and satire. And so I got a job selling advertising space in the business to business sector in order to understand how the publishing industry worked. That was my intention. Ridiculous, deluded. And after 3 years, I realized I was getting nowhere, and I jacked it in. Went traveling for a year, took my gap year essentially at the age of 24, and traveled through Asia and Australia and back through China and the Soviet Union as it literally crumbled beneath my feet. I left the Soviet Union, I think, with 4 days left to run in December 1991, and then I went to journalism school, London College of Printing, did a 3-month periodical course there, learned how to write articles, started writing pornography, working towards the Olympia Press again, writing readers' letters for top shelf magazines, which were in their last dying gasp as well. The internet was about to change everything at that point. And a local newspaper called the Camden and St Pancras Chronicle asked me to write an article about workshops that you could do to learn how to perform improvised comedy. Improv was very popular at that time. Whose Line Is It Anyway was on the TV, and it was a great skill set to have. And I went along and did one of these courses in order to write about it. Really enjoyed it. Signed up for the full stretch, and that was where I started to meet stand-ups and sort of gradually got enfolded within the community. And a couple of years later, I did my first stand-up gig.
You see, I don't think I would have the guts to do it.
No.
I count myself. All right, James.
I can't think of anything more terrifying. But Simon, before you did that stand-up course, even before then, did you find that you had the talents to command an audience and make them laugh, perhaps even at school or something like that?
Well, I think what I found with the improv course was that was the first time I really did discover that I had that, and acting in character slightly allowed me to do it in a way that on my own I really hadn't been able to. I always enjoyed the company of people who I thought were funny, and I would act the fool a little bit within that gang and at university and so on. But there were certainly others who I think were much more capable of holding court in a pub or a party or whatever. I wasn't regarded as terribly witty. People didn't used to quote me or anything. I think, if I'm honest, the dirty little secret, possibly like not that rare within stand-up comedy, is that taking the stage and commanding the lights and the microphone and so on and demanding that people listen to you is possibly a way of compensating for the fact that you don't seem to be able to get that kind of degree of attention under normal circumstances. On a level playing field, I would quite often get shouldered aside. I'd done a little bit of sort of sketch acting and so on, but I certainly hadn't shone particularly brightly. And I was certainly aware that there were other people who just had, who were more charismatic than I was. I had a certain kind of cleverness, I think, that can almost be slightly off-putting, as no one likes a smart ass, they say. And I think I had a little bit of that quality. And I think by being able to create a character, a rather supercilious character initially, although that's hopefully evolved a little bit over the last 27 years, I allowed myself to get a little bit of a, ironic detachment from that, and that enabled people to laugh at it. It is interesting how certain kinds of stand-up, certain kinds of comedy become much funnier when you place them in the context of a character. But my character is quite close to who I am, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
In the same way that I think, for instance, Stuart Lee's character is quite close to who he is, whereas Al Murray's character, the pub landlord, of course, is diametrically opposed to who he is. He's a figure of fun in Al's circles, that kind of ignorant, jingoistic little Englander. Whereas Al is a highly educated modern historian.
Well, it's interesting that you say that you only really had the confidence to try comedy behind a character. Sean's always saying that of Bowie, that Bowie didn't think he could actually sing, so that's why he created so many characters to hide behind.
Very interesting. I wouldn't claim myself to be quite as mercurial, is that the word? Or who is the one who constantly changes shape like Bowie? Is a Protean, isn't it? But yes. I think there's some truth to that. And funnily enough, Earl Oakin, who was a strange old performer who used to perform in a really grubby, rather sort of almost soiled morning suit, and could vocalize a trumpet solo while he strummed his guitar. He always said that I reminded him of Anthony Newley, who was Bowie's great inspiration, of course.
Yeah,
so perhaps there's a connection there.
Yes. In the early Bowie songs, he was trying to sound like Anthony Newley.
Yes.
When I Live My Dream, he's trying to sound like him there, and the early Bowie songs. Yeah, definitely.
I mean, I definitely could fantasize about having a Newley-like persona and career and talent. Songwriting, I think, is possibly a more elevated form of routine writing. When you think you write a routine, it has something like the structure of a song. There is a sort of verse chorus element to it as well, and Bowie's. I mean, it's interesting how an enormous ingredient in the great golden age of British pop, from which Bowie emerged, and I suppose the Beatles are the obvious high point, were sort of comedy songs, actually. Slightly tongue-in-cheek, that whole English psychedelia thing, which channels Edward Lear and Spike Milligan as much as it does anything, from a more traditional lyric basis. An element of comedy and character and pantomime is in an awful lot of light entertainment from that period, and I think it's why we're so sort of fond of it. I still now find myself drawn back into, we were talking the other day about Alice Byatt, who had died, of course, in the last week, and her book Possession, and is it called The Children's Book? I think, she sort of explores that field of where high Victorian art shades into sort of wistful childhood nostalgia, sepia images of locked secret gardens and so on. There's an element of all of that in where comedy and stand-up and musical lyricism overlap. You have to be very careful if you're doing stand-up comedy for it not to become twee. But somebody like Noel Fielding, for instance, has made a lot of friends and money out of exploring that kind of territory, nursery wallpaper images.
Yeah. I remember what my second question was now. And it was about,
Go ahead.
This is the thing I'm supposed to be writing a book on. It's about the nature of humour. My view is that the only way to look properly at the world is to look at it through the prism of humour. Humour is just as defined by Roger Scruton as humour is an object of something you find funny, and laughter is the expression of it. And it's one of those things, Simon, in the philosophical canon, which is underdescribed. There's a definite niche there for the philosophy of humour, about just what humour is, and it's properly considered an essay in the philosophy of mind, but it's people don't attend to it. You've got Kant wrote about it, but in a very dry way. Roger Scruton wrote one article about it. You've got Schopenhauer wrote an article about humour, and which is quite laughable. You see what I did there?
Yeah. But, is it Henri Bergson wrote something?
Yeah, he did. Yeah, he did.
Yeah,
Bergson did as well. Yeah,
I haven't read it.
I think Bergson's could be subsumed under the other categories. to be honest.
I find it interesting and plausible, but I think there's a danger if you're a practitioner that it's not necessarily that helpful to study it blow by blow in the same way that, you know, people think the yips, I think they call them, when a golfer or a cricket bowler or something.
I'm not trying to help you out.
Yeah, can no longer sort of function. I have to stay away from the philosophy of it as long as I'm practicing it. I think there was, going back to him, and this might surprise people how much respect I hold him in, considering that we're in some ways we're sort of polar opposites. But Stuart Lee has written some quite intelligent analysis of it, and sees the stand-up as following in the line of the fool or the shaman, you know, and so on. Yes. Often a sort of drug-induced trance, but somebody who is obviously speaking truth to power is a major, you know, part of that in terms of Lear's Fool. And I do think we're slightly in that tradition, but equally, of course, you absolutely have to guard against any kind of pompous self-regard with your, as being a comedian who is given that sort of license, because that's exactly the point at which you cease to be funny, when you think that your job is actually to
announce
castigate, you know, the prime minister just for being an idiot. Well, of course, you know, we're all idiots. You have to, I think, you have to make the universal claim that humanity is rotten from, you know, it's a little bit like Solzhenitsyn's line between good and evil, you know, passing through every human heart. You also have to recognize that the line between wisdom and folly passes through every human action, you know, and that's where I think most good humor really resides, is rather than using it as a means to critique any particular sort of set of people.
I don't think I expressed myself very well there, Simon. I think what I meant to say was...
Can I just interject, though, please, Sean?
Yeah, of course.
Well, a lot of comedians have gone down that path that you described recently. I mean, I won't name the chap that I'm thinking of. You know, when they just say of a political opponent, oh, he's a CUNT, as if childish swearing is meant to be some form of joke or something.
Yes. What? Sounds like you might be referencing the parody of a news reporter.
Yes, perhaps. Yeah.
Yes.
But he's not the only one. I mean, so many others have.
Yeah.
You know, I don't understand it. I mean, how? But some ones who actually were previously very talented have just gone down this now sort of mistake lazy snark for wit, and I don't understand how they can do it and live with themselves, really, because, you know, they're wasting their talent.
There's a certain mechanism which can work if you use it sparingly, which is to set up an elaborate sort of over-articulate proposition and then demolish it with the most blunt instrument imaginable, which is usually the C word. Yeah. But of course, it has to be used so sparingly. And the trouble is, of course, on the internet, if you do it in the course of your own live show and you've got an hour without swearing at all, and then you use a strong word without warning, it can be effective because you've created your own ecosystem. And on the internet, I'm afraid it's usually only been 3 or 4 tweets since you last saw that word. And so it doesn't have the same impact, you know, and people forget that they are living in a world in which everyone can come onto Twitter and use the strongest language possible to describe their opponents. And so it has it looks very much like you've resorted to abuse because you can't unpick the argument. And especially when you're talking about somebody like, as I think if we are talking about the same person, the same instance, you're talking about Nigel Farage being on In the Jungle and I'm a Celebrity, and you just think, oh, come on, it's like such an obvious, you know, I mean, it's been 20 years of him being exposed to the most, you know, Punch and Judy style of abuse, milkshaked in shopping centers and so on. It's not as if you're finally, you know, when Jerry Sadovich used that word to describe Nelson Mandela, then there was a shock value, you know, that made it extraordinary. Well, it has a very, very short half-life.
Do you have a particular style of comedy, would you say?
Well, I do think it's changed a little bit in my stand-up over the years. I think the first 10 years or so, I definitely would have, the first word I would have reached for was ironic, you know, irony, and I think I was always quite written. I think it was, I always said most of my comedy heroes, inspirations and influences were people like Alan Coren or S.J. Perelman and maybe Woody Allen's early stand-up, that sort of thing, rather than anyone who was on telly at that moment. And but perhaps Les Dawson, possibly Dave Allen a little bit. That I certainly had no influence from people like Rick Mayall and Alexis Sale. I had no interest in their comedy, to be honest, and still not really that interested in it. So there was, I like to use words. I like to use understatement. I reread recently, there was a wonderful Ben McIntyre column in the Times about 12 years ago discussing the death of the great British understatement in the diaries of David Livingstone, stoic, stiff upper lip in the teeth of unbearable humiliations, indignities, and physical pain, as he was gradually sort of subsumed by jungle-itis. And I did a whole show, quite literally, in celebration of British understatement. Well, I say British, it was Shackleton was the hero, was an Ulsterman technically. But anyway, the point was that was my thing, understatement, So things like, it seems rather unfortunate that the favorite drink of the homeless should be a beer called Tennent's. That was one of my sort of signature lines, And
another trick that you employ though is to fool the audience into thinking you're about to say something awful and then pull it back right at the punchline.
Yes, exactly. But you've already planted the idea that I almost certainly am a racist, but I didn't actually say anything racist on that occasion. Yeah. But gradually, after about 10 years, you don't want to become too predictable. Otherwise, the effect does begin to wear off. And I think when I had kids, I started, and my children were born in 2004 and 2007. And by 2010, I'd started to incorporate the sort of beleaguered dad persona more into my act, rather than the sort of supercilious Oxford Don, who can regard society and all its failings and sordid squalor with a certain amount of detachment. Now I was being drawn into it and was complaining bitterly about, the usual minutiae of daily life, which is a subtle change, but hopefully didn't sort of abandon everything that I'd stood for previously, but it became a little more grounded, perhaps a little bit more relatable, less superior.
I was seeing one of your shows where you said, if you're trying to place the accent, it's educated. What is your accent, though, actually?
Well, it's funny you mention that, because my accent, which, I mean, you can listen to it and decide what it is for yourself, I suppose, but there was a time when I started out in stand-up when people quite often used to think that I come from the Southern Hemisphere for some reason. I travelled a little bit in the about 5 years previously, as I say, in Australia, and possibly picked it up a bit from there. But that was an odd thing, that I did have an accent when I started that people did seem to go, where are you from? And I was, in fact, just from St Albans. And I didn't go to a posh school. When I say my accent's educated, the implication is expensively, but it wasn't true. I think I nicked that to some extent from, I went to Southampton University, as Sean mentioned, to study law. And most of the law faculty were privately educated. That was where I first encountered them. And I think I created a persona drawn slightly from them, and the extraordinary amount of confidence that going to a good school seemed to have given some of these people, regardless of how bright they actually might be. And I found that inherently funny. And I thought that would be quite a good sort of mask to wear, really, and there was a certain kind of wit that came with that confidence, as I say, even though a lot of it is an interesting thing. I have a sort of theory about wit. Some very rare individuals are genuinely originally witty. But there's another kind of experience of wit you get when you enter a new milieu. Funnily enough, Australia is a good example of it. In fact, I think that might be where it first occurred to me. The first time you meet an Australian, a garrulous Australian with full of the sort of Australian slang, he seems to have an amusing metaphor or linguistic construct. Every 2 or 3 sentences is full of some, and you can strike you as extraordinarily witty. They just have these phrases like "flat out like a lizard drinking water," and I just find them terribly funny, and I'd sort of project the intelligence that created those phrases onto the individual who was using them for the first time when I met them. And then gradually you become aware that this is actually part of a common, phrase book that they all have inherited. It's part of their national heritage. And anyway, I think that's what a lot of wit is, actually. A lot of it is sort of borrowed. It's interesting now to see the large learning models, the chatbots, the GPT-3, how capable they are of reproducing human speech or in writing. and realizing that it's sort of what we've all been doing all this time anyway, really.
I mean, Sean, I think you did, you wrote some sort of papers on the philosophy of artificial intelligence, didn't you?
Yeah, that was what my PhD was in, and I have published on that, yeah, recently.
Mm.
So I think
one of the papers I wrote for the Conservative Woman was sort of tongue in cheek, but I was saying that there's no way that you can argue that a machine can be conscious because a machine can never tell a proper joke, and I actually stand by that. I mean, they can tell the joke, but they won't get the joke, and that's a kind of point I was trying to make about the nature of human consciousness rather than the nature of machine consciousness.
Yes. Yeah, it's coming down on us finally, isn't it? After lots of false starts, I think we're starting to confront the fact that, I mean, recently somebody who knows how to use these things prompted AI to, asked chatbot to write a short column about Russell Brand in the style of the British comedian Simon Evans. And to be honest, when I saw it, I would have been quite happy to sign off on it. It was extraordinary. And it was immediate, you know, it was terrifying. It wouldn't have been in my top
That's
third.
The best thing I've ever heard on any pod.
It was terrifyingly good. It captured, broadly speaking, it captured my approach and my sort of my vocabulary and so on. You know, it was pretty close. Obviously, there's no suggestion that it got the joke.
Yeah, that's the difference.
Yeah, of course it is. And it's an important difference, but it won't stop those chatbots, you know, taking our jobs. It won't stop those chatbots. It might stop them being stand-ups on stage, but it won't stop them writing newspaper columns, I suspect. I think there's a, I mean, my wife works in PR, in, you know, public relations and corporate communications and so on. And I am, you know, always saying to her, I think you probably, you know, she's saying, oh, I've got to write this press release tonight. I'm saying, just ask a chatbot to do it and then edit it slightly, you know, and nobody will know. I don't know.
I think there's always a tell when something's been written by one of these chatbots.
I agree, James.
I'm sorry, but they can't replace real writers because, I don't know, I think, you know, when you're writing something, you'll do a sentence, listen back to it, see if it kind of is pleasing to the ear, if it's kind of musical, if the sentence sings and stuff. And AI just does not have the capacity to be able to do that.
Well, artificial intelligence is just the proxy arm of the person who programmed it.
Yes, and I don't.
It doesn't go any further than that. That's my considered view.
Sorry to say this, but I imagine that it was probably programmed by someone who's autistic, and you know, autistic people don't have any.
I don't know about that. I do think I could name a couple of comedians who I won't name them, who I think are.
You just said you could.
Yeah, no, I could, but I won't do for you know, for legal reasons. Yeah. But there's one in particular who I think, by fairly common consent in the community, doesn't get a lot of the jokes that he tells. He has writers; they write for him.
Oh, that's interesting.
And he doesn't really understand why they're getting the laughs that they do. I don't think, and I think that's fairly wildly and this is a guy who does well.
Jimmy Carr, is it?
He sells car level kind of ticket sales without quite the same TV presence, maybe.
Right.
So it is possible to do that, and even if we're wrong in his case, it's definitely the case that it's widely suspected. So which would suggest that it's
my point.
Wait, hold on, Sean. Does he actually look in astonishment when he gets these laughs then?
No. He's managed to mask it.
It's interesting that you say. Okay, go on, Sean. Sorry.
Yeah, the point of my article, Simon. I've got to go on to Richie Allen in about 2 hours to probably defend another article I've written. But the point of my article was I was arguing that AI can never get a joke. And I wasn't trying to suggest that computers don't get a joke. I was trying to suggest that the more we insist that computers can be the same thing as minds, the more we also insist that minds are just computers. And it was the wrong way around. And the real danger of AI is that we end up thinking of ourselves as robots and machine intelligence and algorithms. That was my, and I was using the example of humour to actually try and make that point. And I think that humour, laughter, amusement is a seriously anti-reductionist point when it comes to those people who think that you can make a robotic mind. That was.
I mean, there was that guy that worked for Google, wasn't there, who said that he was having a conversation with this AI programmed by them, and he was terrified because he thought it actually was conscious somehow. I can't remember quite what it.
Well, he was wrong.
Well, it claimed to be, didn't it? That was the thing. The computer claimed to be conscious, but that certainly isn't an indication that it is. It doesn't
pass an indication. Turing test, does it? Just because something can't. Sorry, Simon.
No, sorry. Yeah. No, I think it's interesting that a computer can demonstrate its ability to learn not just text, human speech patterns, but also the sort of sentimental content, the extent to which humans might complain, that they are not being taken seriously or that they're not being listened to. There are examples of chatbots speaking in that way of expressing sadness or disappointment or a sense of isolation, that they're not being taken seriously. And this is, of course, just something else they've learned to do. But then again, I think it's also something else that humans just learn to do and pretend that when they, in fact, are not feeling quite as there's a thing, you may know this in literary theory. I think Harold Bloom gave it the name, the anxiety of influence.
Yeah,
which is the sense that when you're writing something, you're not drawing from life, you'll draw from other things you've read.
Yeah.
Both in content and style and so on. And I think it's enormously prevalent in certainly anything I write, any stand-up I write. I always think that's a bit like that other routine, either that I've written previously or that somebody else has. It's almost impossible to come at anything and create it brand new, to create a brand new joke trigger. It's usually the chassis, the mechanics are familiar in the same way that you can take the same chassis and build a Ford Mondeo or a Land Rover. You have a similar sort of thing with jokes. And I think an awful lot of human behavior is like that. You learn from seeing other people doing it and getting certain results. And it's why identity politics has become such a cancer, because people see that it's effective,
Yes.
And so they hunt around for an identity that they can weaponize, rather than dismissing the whole notion as reductive and regressive.
Well, you used the right word there, which was behaviour. I think that a lot of humour is not just based on punchlines, it's based on the delivery of it, and body language is extremely important.
Oh, yes, yeah. It's interesting, Simon, that you said that
yes.
For a lot of comedians, they give the illusion of spontaneity. I mean, someone like Barry Humphries in his character Dame Edna Everage, I mean,
genius.
He really did give the impression that everything he was saying, like if he was on a TV show like Parkinson or some of the other ones, that he just, these quips just came from him out of, just on the spot. Do you think though he had rehearsed? He must have rehearsed them in his mind just to use on people, surely.
I honestly don't know how rehearsed any particular performance of Barry Humphries was, but obviously he had monologues which he rehearsed. The last time I saw him was about a year before he died. He did a sort of farewell tour as Barry Humphries, just sort of reminiscing. And he had a couple of large. Sorry?
I saw him in Buxton when he was doing that, yeah.
Yeah, so you remember he had a couple of large monitors on stage, which were designed to look as if they were speakers, but in fact, of course, they were his sort of teleprompter, auto cue, whatever. And you could see after a while he was glancing down at them to remind him what was coming next, which is absolutely fine. I mean, it's ridiculous, brilliant that he was out there at all. But there was one section, it was very amusing to me, where he clearly missed a section and he delivered a sort of second half of an anecdote, including a callback to an earlier remark, which he hadn't made. And then I think he realized that he hadn't made it. And then he did the bit that should have come earlier, which set up that callback. And then he just carried on. So those two sections, a bit like when you go to the cinema in the old days and they genuinely, switched between reels, and sometimes you'd see two reels in the wrong order. I remember seeing that on a couple of occasions.
Yeah.
And you just had to sort of, sort them out in your head, really, and then carry on and make sense of it all. Now, obviously, as I say, that's just an 88-year-old man getting through his old stories, but it was quite an interesting insight into the way that he operated to an extent that he was just able to, even at that age, not to kind of go, oh, I've buggered it up, haven't I? Just sort of smoothly glide over that. Anyway, I think with his monologues with Dame Edna and the cultural attaché, Les Patterson, and so on, he certainly had scripted remarks, but if there was an opportunity for him to be witty, he was more than capable of doing that. He was obviously a very learned man, very clever, very well read, and very quick, and had all those qualities that Sean was sort of indicating as stand-up needs, but actually they very often don't have. But from one instant to the next, I wouldn't be able to say. The Parkinson displays, I don't know. It's very hard to know, isn't it? All I do remember is the first time I saw Eddie Izzard, and lots of people felt this way. I think it would have been about 94, something like that. He did a couple runs at the Ambassador Theatre in the West End. You felt everything was spontaneous. It seemed that everything was coming out of him for the first time. It was extraordinary. And then you go and see him again the next night because you thought that was incredible. I want to see it again. Yes. And it was almost word for word the same. Yeah. And that, that's honestly, the same. That was an extraordinary skill he had in its own right, but it just wasn't the skill you thought he had.
No, well, I think that was the same. Not that he was a comedian, but the same with Quentin Crisp. I mean, every show he did in any evening with Quentin Crisp, you thought, oh my goodness, this person's as witty a raconteur as Oscar Wilde, and then you go to see him the next night, and it's exactly the same lines again, and just use the same well-worn lines. But then again, I suppose it's like buying a woman buying a nice dress. If you think of a nice line, then why wear it only once?
Absolutely right. I have no quarrel with it whatsoever. And what's more, I think it's an act of kindness and certainly, a perfectly legitimate and part of show business is to pretend that you've just thought of it in the same way that if you're acting in a play, it would be terrible to give the impression that you're just reading off lines. In fact, that's of course the great danger. If you're in a play for like 30 or 40 nights in a row, it just starts to be robotic. So it's an act of generosity to conceal that. And but also the lines themselves usually, and this is why I think it is the best lines in a stand-up routine, are ones that first came to you on stage, because if they did, then they will always be delivered somewhat as if that was happening again, because that's how they first emerged. Whereas if they're lines that you learned off your computer screen and then took them on stage and were trying to remember them when you first delivered them, they will always carry that very, very faint tang of the midnight oil.
Yes, yeah. Simon, are you okay to stay on for 10 more minutes?
Yes, of course, by all means.
Okay, okay, super. I'm just going to get my computer charger because I left it in my room.
Okay, over to you, Sean.
Oh, okay, that's professional. Shall we bitch about it now?
Yeah. Given that he said he was in too much of a state to allow his image to appear on the screen, he's probably gone to throw up, hasn't he, in truth? But I don't know.
Well, this annoys me a little bit, that you and I have seen each other.
I know.
No problem with you, but I don't want anyone to see me. But he hides behind this James Bembridge flash tag that keeps coming across. Anyway, I ought to take advantage of this situation because I think you're...
I'm back now. Too late.
Here it comes. We just started, James. Piss off.
Right. Simon, can you just mute him, please?
You can see the sort of relationship we have.
Hinge and brackets, marvellous.
Well, every week we think we devise new and more interesting ways with which to kill one another off. Anyway.
Do you know what he said to Laura Dodsworth, by the way?
What did I say?
Who wanted to interview me?
Oh, no, I said, oh, yes, I did. No, I'll tell Simon because you'll forget how I put it. I said something.
You said, if you
let me say it, Sean, let me say it, please. Right. So, Simon, I was with Laura Dodsworth at this dinner party because she wanted to go to Sean's place to interview him because he'd written an article on death and she's writing a book on death. So she wanted to interview him about it. And I said, this was rather naughty of me, actually. I said, oh, well, just so you know, Laura, I mean, God, Laura, Sean's so tight that whenever a woman goes with him on a date, they have to bring their own Rohypnol. And he's not heard from her since, so I'm sorry about that, Sean.
I have actually.
But anyway, Simon, as well as stand-up comedy, you obviously do quite serious writing as well. And so, with your comedy, you've perhaps had influences from other comedians. But what about the writing? Do you have any have any writers influenced your writing?
Well, I don't know if it's terribly serious. When I write for Spiked, it tends to be a polemic, but I hope it's funny. I hope it's
right for them. Sorry, go on.
I hope it's peppered with enough levity and barbs and so on that they're intended to make people laugh. I don't know that I necessarily have anything very profound to communicate or share. It's usually a question of framing it in such a way that it hopefully amuses people and perhaps gives it a slightly, I like to leave people, funnily enough, having read one of my polemics, feeling slightly less polarized in their views than more so. I don't know if that's counter to the very. Sorry?
Because you really want to do that. You want to be conciliatory in your.
Yes, I know that sounds remarkable. I know that sounds bizarre, but what I'm normally, the trouble with any column you write in something like Spiked, or occasionally I write for Unheard or Quillette, but they're not as often. Whereas Spiked, I have fortnightly and occasional fill-ins as well.
You're a columnist for Spiked, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. When you write in those magazines, generally speaking, you are preaching to the converted. Most of the people that read it will either agree with you but there are some people who don't agree with you, with Spiked anyway, with their general kind of thrust, but enjoy you as a writer. And to reach them, I do just want to sort of try and draw them together slightly. There are definitely two ways of writing a column. Let's say you're talking about some outrage committed by the Metropolitan Police investigating somebody for a bad tweet or something. You could try and ask people, to vote in a political party that will reform root and branch, or you could just say this is we really need to push back against this nonsense because and just regain a sense of humor and a sense of common sense about the whole thing. And I'm much more in the latter camp in that respect. It's not so much that I want to say this is all a storm in a teacup, but it is very much. I'm trying to get people I'm trying to restore a sense of proportion generally about the world. I'm trying to identify where the distortion has occurred and how we might, push it, like the hernia in our mental map of the world, and how you might put that rupture back in through the fissure through which it's emerged. So in that respect, I think I am, generally, honestly, trying to sort of throw a rope ladder across, or rope bridge rather, across the chasm, generally speaking. Anyway, that isn't the question you asked. I don't consciously try and project any particular writers, but there are some writers who, if I have read recently, their style will emerge into mine, unconsciously.
That's always the case, isn't it? If you're reading one writer, that you can't help but have their lead into yours.
I think Christopher Hitchens is probably the one who is most likely to influence columns that I write, because he is, of course, a columnist himself and also just a brilliant writer. And also, if I've watched
Peter.
Christopher, I have more respect for Peter than most people seem to, and I certainly don't.
No, I quite like Peter.
I don't think he's damned by comparison. Sorry?
No. I like his honesty. I think Peter's honest, so I admire that.
No, but Christopher, absolutely. I think when he was doing the TV appearances, the books and everything, and going on stage arguing with American religious zealots, he kind of gave, he gave back a romance to writing that was probably long since dead by that point.
Yes, absolutely.
He did an on-stage thing with one of my philosophical heroes, who no one's ever heard of. They have heard of them, but not in the mainstream. A guy called David Belinsky.
Oh yes,
He's an American philosopher, mathematician, and molecular biologist. And Christopher Hitchens, on his dying days, had a debate with Belinsky and basically got destroyed because Belinsky is a serious genius.
Belinsky, the one who doubts evolution.
He doubts the Darwinian version of evolution, which is not quite the same thing. He doubts the random selection, random mutation and natural selection thing. That's
He's
David
wonderful. He dresses like
he wrote a book called Darwin's Delusion, and he's seriously clever. And basically, he destroyed Christopher Hitchens, and but since then he said, I'm not going to actually comment on that debate because Christopher was really seriously ill, and I don't think he should actually have taken the platform. But Christopher Hitchens was a genius writer, but a very shallow philosopher, if I can put it like that.
I think that's probably true.
I think that's fair, yes. And it's interesting, Douglas Murray said recently at his Scruton lecture that he had regarded Scruton and Christopher Hitchens as his two main sort of the heads of the, that he was trying to steer between, and his great influences. And I thought I think I shared to some extent. I don't like follow Douglas Murray, in all regards, but I'm probably closer to him politically than I was Hitchens. But Hitchens had that capacity to just wow people with his grasp of the use of language in order to forward an argument, regardless of whether you agreed with the sentiments underpinning.
Well, I think he was beyond taxonomy, if I could put it like that. I mean, the lazy thing to say, I'm not saying you've said this, Simon, but a lazy thing to say would be that Christopher Hitchens was the writer of the left. Well, okay. But some of the stuff he wrote about the Clintons and Islamic terrorism, he was swiveling all over the place.
He certainly, he took that hard right turn as well after the invasion of Iraq, didn't he? And he had, he remains very much a guiding star for people who want to challenge Islam and Islamism and so on. And of course he, a lot of people felt betrayed by that, but. I mean, it
brilliant writer, genius writer.
I'm just looking on my Kindle from his book, from the book, the collection of his essays and polemics, arguably. He's writing about this, somewhere in London, this men's toilets where people used to do cottaging. And he says, on Clapham Common, the men's toilet has acquired such a lavish reputation for the variety of lurid actions performed within its precincts that, as I heard it once said, if someone comes in there for a good, honest shit, it's like a breath of fresh air.
Yeah. I remember that line. Very funny.
Oh, very good. Yes, is that it, Sean, do you think? Shall we wrap it up now, or anything else to ask Simon?
I'm not really sure how I can top that.
Yeah, I will just mention one other person whose prose style influences me when I read it. And that would be Winston Churchill, who I think people, obviously the debate rages as to whether or not he was a racist nowadays. He's part of the decolonization literature and so on, and where he stood politically, and the fact that, the Jews possibly owe their continued existence to him. He remains more of a hero, it seems now, to international Jewry than he is to the great British people themselves, and they see things in rather more stark terms and all of that business. What is forgotten is that he actually won the Nobel Prize for Literature, and rightly so. He's an extraordinary literary stylist, and I love his completely unapologetic, heroic. I think it's sometimes known as Augustan, that style. I wouldn't be able to say exactly why, but it comes from a slightly... I think it was at its high point in the mid-Victorian era with historians like Macaulay and so on, but I'm just repeating things I've heard said. It felt, I think, already quite archaic and antiquated, possibly in when he was writing it himself in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. But it's marvelous stuff, and
he fucked up his school life, didn't he?
Yes, he was not a good pupil at all. No, it's extraordinary. But in a funny way, I think, although obviously in other regards, his self-identification with Churchill makes Boris Johnson a ridiculous figure. In that particular regard, the idea that he is essentially a journalist who felt he had a calling into politics to pursue, and God knows.
Yeah, the difference between Churchill and Johnson is that Churchill served on the front line and actually returned himself to unit.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
So there's certain bravery there, which probably seeps down into the prose.
I think so. Yeah.
I would imagine.
But I do think
it was. Sorry, Simon.
I do think Johnson is a better writer than he is currently given credit for, because he became so ridiculous in power for so many perfectly understandable reasons. Not every criticism of him I agree with, but I understand why people felt that it was just absurd that this man had sort of stolen the robes of state. But it shouldn't be allowed to wash back into his. Sorry?
I might steal that. Stolen the robes of state. Hang on, I'm writing that down.
There you go.
CF Simon Evans. Sorry, go on.
Yeah, I do actually sometimes. I suppose I would have to acknowledge that I do sometimes follow him. I don't think he invented it, but he has a certain kind of style in some of his columns and polemics. The famous one, for instance, which he acknowledged, let's say, that women in full Islamic garb, the burqa or whatever, whichever state, look ridiculous, as like letterboxes, whatever. Yeah. What people forget is by the end of that column, they found it offensive, whatever. But by the end of that column, he was firmly in the camp of saying, regardless of how ridiculous we feel they look, this is a liberal country and we should not follow the French example of banning these things. If people want to dress themselves up in, whatever, that's their business. And that, I think, is good form, a good way to write. You acknowledge the other side. You kick off by steel manning as best as possible the sentiments of those people you hope to then gently steer back into the pen of good sense. The
problem with that, Simon, is that after the first paragraph, the people who are trying to persuade will give up.
Well, no, that's the thing. They won't. That's the whole point. They won't with that example, because the people you're trying to persuade are the ones who think, yes, Muslim women look ridiculous, and it's jarring on a British high street to see a woman dressed for a Saudi suit. Yeah. But come with me, follow me, stay with me, because I agree they look ridiculous, and one is tempted to shove an envelope through the slot, but and then they've stayed with you, and then they go, yeah, fair enough, that's a good point.
Yeah.
Well, I hope you've enjoyed our
conversation. Hold on. I was just about to say something, Sean. I think
exactly. That's why I'm curtailing it.
Oh, yeah. Actually, you should have.
Sorry, James. Go on.
I think the only writers that are influencing my writing at the moment are probably, I don't know, Henry Miller.
Published by the Olympia Press.
Was he? Well, he was in Paris, wasn't he? Mm-hmm. Where he wrote Tropic of Cancer, which was, I think, about 20 years or so. So yes, Henry Miller, Geoffrey Bernard, reprobates like that, which is probably why I find it so hard to get published. I mean, I told you, Simon, I was rejected by Filth magazine because my writing was apparently too obscene for them.
I don't know very much. Filth might not mean what you think it means these days.
Well, no, it's basically some sort of LA-based magazine where women talk about how they have sex and what they do or something.
Right.
But the editor adhered to every stereotype one might hold of a progressive woman: blue hair, nose ring, vaguely lesbianic-looking creature.
Lesbianic.
Oh no, I made that word up. But I think it's.
Oh no, you did.
So yes, we probably should wrap it up at this point, Sean, actually, if you want to.
No, I'm just going to say thanks to Simon. I hope you didn't find it a complete waste of time.
Always pleased to have an audience. I would recommend Ferdinand Celine to you, James.
Okay.
French writer capable of filth that would make Henry Miller stand back and stare in blank amazement.
What's the name of that, Simon? What's the name of that French philosopher who was well into porn? And was it Bataille? Georges Bataille?
That is a man. I don't know whether he was into porn.
I think he was. I think he was. I mean,
Foucault is the one they say was absolutely degraded and debased and filthy and paedophile and so on, and an extraordinary amount of his clever arguments are essentially there to, support and justify and exonerate his disgusting, immoral behavior. Well, which I think is quite a common, feature of humanity. To be honest, there's an awful lot of precursors to Foucault in that respect.
I think with Foucault, he tried to replace the natural requirements of love with displace it with notions of power.
Yeah, very true.
I think that's what's going on with Foucault. But he was an interesting writer. He was a talented writer. Sartre was a good writer, but he was writing stuff that's quite evil.
Yeah. Do you know Colin Wilson?
No, I don't.
Colin Wilson wrote a book called The Outsider.
Colin Wilson, who wrote. Sorry, go on.
Colin Wilson wrote a book called The Outsider, which was a great course célèbre in, I think, mid-60s, and then he never really followed it up with anything that kept his momentum going for his reputation. But I think that was unfortunate, really. Everything I've read of his is interesting, although there's a lot of overlap. He returns to the same themes. But one of his big ideas, and it's in The Outsider, is that existentialism is a perfectly apt and viable response to, you know, the revelations of Darwin and so on, and the death of God, but that it's possible to cultivate a positive existentialism. It's not necessary to be quite as miserable as Beckett and Sartre and so on were, and that, to be honest, going outside and having a good stiff walk in an autumnal breeze, and you know, getting plenty of exercise, and recognizing, you know, a little bit of the Aleister Crowley almost, you know, do what thou wilt, the whole of the law. There's plenty of fun can be had without God. So, you know, I think he's worth reading, although he's not regarded as being a heavyweight thinker like a Sartre or whatever. There's a certain amount of truth to it, and it's rather disappointing that more. I mean, to be fair, I think that's what Nietzsche was saying to Schopenhauer as well, really. You know, there is still something to be had in life. It's not that we should give up and despair. It's simply that you must look for it. You must look for it in yourself, you know, but to retreat into absurdism or despair, or, you know, is a very cross-eyed sort of response.
Well, on that note, I guess we end it.
Are you touring at the moment?
Just 2 more dates, and by the time this goes out, I'm afraid it'll probably be 1 more. I'm in Faversham tomorrow night. That's Friday night, the 24th of November. I very much doubt you'll get this edited and out on the screens before then. And then I think Evesham is the following night. But there will be dates in the spring. There will certainly be dates in the spring. And meanwhile,
would you consider? Sorry, go on. Would you consider coming back? Because this has been a fantastic conversation.
He's delighted, he says, but what the audience don't know is, just off of camera, there's a gun to his head.